So hi, Oliver here again. I have another great question here again related to microbiology that I would like to talk about. Also, of course, to microscopy. It's a pretty long question, really. Please check whether food left out at room temperature for more than 2 hours is safe to eat by making comparison of the same food cooked at the same time, once checked right away and once checked later. Are there more bacteria in the one being left out at room temperature? Because it's common to reheat food, sometimes even more than on one day, sometimes not even reheated, just left out in a glass cabinet. Don't most foods contain sugar, acid or salt where those microbes don't like to live in? Well, if so, how come they even multiply in there? Well, first of all, thank you very much for the question. Actually, there are multiple questions in here, so I need to get started at the basics. Well, first of all, it is not possible to use microscopes to check for food safety for several reasons. First of all, if you look at a microscope at food that is cooked and one that has been left out for a few hours and then you check again, it is like this, that the number of bacteria or microorganisms that are now growing on the food has, even though it has increased maybe, you will not be able to identify them because compared to the amount of food that you have, the number is very small. So what you're going to see is if you put a piece of food, a little bit of food on the microscope slide, you're going to see mostly food, but the few bacteria are simply going to be covered up by the food that you put on the slide because there is such a big difference in quantity. Okay, so this is already one issue, and the second thing is you cannot use microscopes to check for food safety because sometimes there are microorganisms, bacteria growing in food and they're part of the food. So for example, in biotechnology you use actually fermentation with bacteria, and there are a lot of bacteria then in the food, but this does not make it unsafe, but that's actually part of the food, because simply by looking at the shape of certain bacteria, even if we were able to identify them or see them, even if they would not, the shape wouldn't tell us much about what type of bacterium it is and whether it's safe to eat the food or not. When you cook the food will have let's say more than 100 degrees centigrade, and then it takes around maybe half an hour for the food to cool down to a temperature where bacteria are able to live. So you cook the food, let's assume it's sterile, okay, let's assume this, and then you allow the food to cool down, then bacteria on the dust and in the air will fall on the food, and then they will not start to multiply right away. What will happen is they will first have to adapt to the new environment, to the new type of food that is present, and this takes some time, maybe an hour, maybe 2 hours, it depends on the bacteria, and this is called the Lark Phase. So this means if you have an XY graph with on the x-axis the time and then on the y-axis the number of bacteria, then at the beginning nothing's going to happen really. Okay, the bacteria require a certain amount of time even to adapt to the new environment, and then only after this has happened, then it will go. The bacteria will start to grow exponentially, and this is then basically the part that you want to try to avoid. And I would probably say that leaving food out for 2 hours, it was cooked and then you leave it out for 2 hours, is not a problem, okay, because most of the bacteria are still going to be in the lag phase. The number of bacteria will not increase so much during this time. I'm going to tell you later about some cases where it is a problem, okay, and then it will go logarithmic, and then after a few hours or some time it will go stationary, and then it will level off. And the reason why it levels off is because the bacteria have produced already waste products, acids for example, which inhibit their own growth, and so it will not continue to grow exponentially forever. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that with the food that you have is that you always stay in the so-called lag phase, and so where there is no increase in bacteria so much. But the number of bacteria at the beginning is so low that you will not be able to detect them with a microscope anyway, because the few bacteria that happen to fall into the food will not really be detectable with a microscope. So that is the more theoretical explanation. Now it is like this, that there are certain cases where I would actually say don't leave food out for 2 hours, and this does not really relate to this question here, because here you're talking about cooked food. But there is one thing that really I don't like at all is when people, for example, do a barbecue, and what they do is they take a plate, and on the plate they put the raw meat, and then what they will do is they will use a fork or some tools to put put the meat on the barbecue, and then they will fry it and they cook it on the barbecue, and then they will use the same fork and they will take the meat, the cooked meat, and put it back on the same plate where there was the raw meat. And this is something that you should not do, because during this half an hour or 45 minutes that it took you to cook the meat, if it's a warm summer's day, you have already increased the number of bacteria dramatically on the plate, okay, because it's standing in the sun, it's warm weather, and if, let's say, we have a generation time, a doubling time of bacteria for 30 minutes, after 1 hour, you already have 4 times as many bacteria growing on the plate as you had before. But these bacteria might be harmful. It might be salmonella, for example, and here even a very low concentration can cause actually an infection, okay, and can cause some problems. So this is actually something that I would more worry about is the raw type of the raw food when it's not properly cooked, okay, yeah, if you're kind of sloppy with barbecuing, then you actually end up transferring the raw meat juice back to your cooked food, and you don't want to do that. Also, for example, if you use a cutting board where you cut some raw meat and then you cut the salad on it and then you eat the salad raw, this is something you should not do, okay. So, and then the next question is what about foods that contain sugar, salt, and acid? Sometimes you deliberately add sugar, like for example in jam and marmalade and so on, salt and acid, like for example vinegar, to actually preserve the food. Sometimes, for example, sauerkraut, it's cabbage which you cut into small stripes and then you allow it to ferment. What will happen is that so-called lactobacilli will grow in the food, and it's like this, that the acid that they produce will actually block or inhibit the growth of other bacteria. These are natural ways of making food preservable, and in what I heard is long time ago, it was like this: they cut the cabbage and then they put them into a large pot, and then the people took off their shoes and with their feet they stamped the cabbage, okay, and this caused bacteria to be transferred from the feet to the cabbage, and a fermentation process started. So this was actually necessary to do that because you were actually inoculating the food with bacteria. But what happened is that because the lactic acid bacteria, and you added salt of course also, you only had certain bacteria growing which were then actually became part of the food, and this also prevented other bacteria, harmful bacteria, from growing in the food. Will there be more bacteria if you wait longer? Yes, but not necessarily bad ones, because in this case the bacteria are actually those microorganisms that actually make the food preservable, okay, preserve the food. What happens if you leave out the food, let's say for 1 day, let's say in a glass cabinet as it says here? My advice would be to rely also to your common sense a little bit, and also to your previous experience. If the food starts to smell bad or look strange or taste sour, and it shouldn't taste sour, then you know that the microorganisms, bacteria, have produced certain products that should not be in the food. But in certain countries, what you do is you add actually certain spices to the food. Garlic, for example, contains a lot of substances that actually kill bacteria and make the food preservable. And if you leave it out for more than 1 day, and it's fine, because the way that the food was spiced and the way that it was cooked, and because of the ingredients, then it's not a problem if experience has shown that this works. If experience has shown that certain food can be cooked and it stores well for 1 day without it being spoiled, because there is no change in taste and texture and appearance, well then this is what experience has shown that it works, okay? Sometimes certain foods have this the due date printed on them, and this is just a general reference, but if the food is not stored properly, then the food will spoil even before that date. And some food can actually be edible and can be eaten even much longer afterwards if it's been properly stored. So I would suggest that you always also rely a little bit on your nose and smell on the food first whether it is acceptable or not, and then if you see that something tastes kind of strange or tastes different than the way it should taste, then definitely you have to throw it away. But microscopes, unfortunately, are probably not going to help us here. How come they even multiply in there when you added sugar, acid and salt? And the reason why those microorganisms multiply in there is because different microorganisms have a different optimum environment for growth. So there are certain bacteria that are more salt tolerant than others, and the reason why many of them do not grow in highly salt concentrated food or sugar concentrated food is because of an osmotic imbalance. So this means bacteria fall into the jam, for example, which contains a lot of sugar, and then what happens is that these will lose water so quickly that they are not able to reproduce. Okay, but some microorganisms are able to reproduce, and if you want to make food storable for a long time, then do not take a spoon, do not go with a spoon into your mouth and then back into the food, because this way you're going to be transferring bacteria from your mouth to the food, and then the food will spoil much faster. Okay, I wish you all the best. Happy microbe hunting as always. Thank you again for the question, and bye bye.